The new governor of Al-Andalusia, Abd al-Rahman, the slashing blade of Caliph Hisham, led his armies northward. One army of northern barbarians, who dared to block the way of the Caliphate's warriors, had already been trampled by their horses' hooves. The matter remained for little: to crush the impudent Charles, who was not even the king of the Franks, and disperse his men that were preparing for the last decisive battle near the small village of Poitiers. The Franks met the uninvited guests as they were accustomed to. A deep infantry phalanx, with its flanks tucked into shrubbery impenetrable to cavalry, blocked the way northward. Large, round shields, a forest of long spears sticking out from behind them, sparse helmets, and even sparser armor. They were ready, though, as they always were. They had no chance of winning, and they knew it very well. But when did that stop the Frankish militia, still not forgetting their grandfathers' precepts about how a man should die? And even more so the vigilantes who looked into the face of their death and smiled at it with their wolfish grin. The Franks, Aquitanians, aristocrats, vigilantes, and militiamen, all together simply the best infantry of the barbarian kingdoms, who mixed in a single formation, looked at the approaching Arab cavalry quite calmly. They had seen worse. That's what almost all the armies of the barbarian kingdoms looked like in their heyday. Extremely sturdy infantry, in the ranks of which stood weeping shoulder to shoulder aristocrats and commoners, that perfectly able to hold the blow, not retreating a step. Such infantry, skillfully putting a wall of shields, not only was almost insensitive to fire, but if necessary, could heartily hit the entire mass, stirring the enemy and throwing him back. If it was not necessary to hold a blow, they could attack a fleeing or defending enemy in a scattered formation. These warriors perfectly threw darts and axes, which they had in abundance, were able to hit the spears friendly in the target, and knew perfectly on which side to take the sacks. Such was the classic infantry of the Dark Ages, which formed the basis of armies throughout Europe. From the northern lands of Britain that lay not far from the borders with the savage Picts, to Aquitaine and central Italy. But where did these infantry come from? And why infantry exactly? Where were the archers and cavalry? And for what reason did the armies of the barbarian kingdoms fight in this way? After all, the Germanic tribes that came to Europe at the decline of the empire fought in a very different way. So where did this new military tradition, which determined the shape of the armies of the early Middle Ages? Let's find out. And to begin, as usual, we'll have to begin with the times of the Roman Empire. Then, in the 4th century, from the east to the lands of the Eternal City, splashed out a human wave of the great migration of peoples, or rather, its vanguard. Germanic tribes that came in motion, driven west by cold and warlike neighbors, went forward in search of fortune and a better life. And in front of them were warriors, and these squads were nothing like the armies of the barbarian kingdoms that appeared on the lands of Europe a few centuries later. The Germans who came to Europe at the end of the empire were mostly light infantry, that is, fought mostly in a scattered formation. Having no significant armor, protected most often only by a small shield, they were armed not only with spears and long axes. Each of them also had throwing spears and axes, which did not hesitate to use for their intended purpose, throwing the enemy before the attack literally rain of sharpened steel. To put it simply, the armies of the Franks, Saxons, Lombards, and other Germans who appeared in the European provinces of Rome were in the main mass of their shooters, perfectly adapted for raids and warfare with the same light infantry. Skilled in guerrilla warfare, capable of dealing a crushing blow even to superior forces, but virtually useless when heavy infantry with their linear formation and large shields came into play. Large units of heavy infantry ignored the shelling with contempt, and martial spirit and fighting skill alone were not enough to break through the solid shield formation of Rome's frontier legions. Therefore, in almost all large and not so large battles, Germanic barbarians suffered defeats from the troops of the empire. That, however, did not make them any less dangerous. Losing another battle, the Germans scattered and went to the tactics of small units quite quickly, forcing the Roman troops to give the territory under the control of the tribes, simply because the legions, despite the large number of enemies around them, had no one to fight. The overwhelming force of the Roman legions couldn't find a worthy target, getting bogged down in petty skirmishes and endless warfare over every hill in the area. It seemed to be an insoluble problem. But not for Rome. Where brute force failed, gold and diplomacy prevailed. and in a few dozen years some Germanic tribes standing under the aquilus of the Eternal City fought with the same Germanic tribes, those with whom they had recently plundered the northern provinces of Rome together. By the middle of the 6th century, most of Rome's frontier legions, called riparienses, were already recruited from local barbarians, or rather barbarian vigilantes, and it was a great solution. Trained to fight in the Roman military tradition, the barbarian units kept the perimeter of the empire quite well, bringing order, suppressing rebellions, and, if necessary, buying precious time for the transfer of the internal legions of the empire to the lands where their presence was required. Yes, from the point of view of discipline and fighting skill, such units were inferior to the real army, which was called in the empire comitatans, and even more so did not compare with the old legions of the heyday of Rome. But to be honest, there was nothing to choose from. It was either the barbarian federates or a 1,000-kilometer border. However, as we all know, this controversial military reform didn't help much either, and the Eternal City fell. But its legions didn't go anywhere. Having ceased to exist as armies of Great Rome, they became again what they were originally. Barbarian chieftains' squads, but they were different squads. Leaders and warriors of the Franks, Saxons, Burgundians, and Lombards, adopting decades of service Roman military tradition, supplementing it with their own military techniques, created a completely new army that combined the firmness of the imperial infantry and the ability to fight in a scattered formation, as their Germanic ancestors. And relying on these cohorts, that even recently were part of the Roman army, the future barbarian kings, and began to build their kingdoms. As is quite understandable, having a well-trained and disciplined army, albeit a small one, it was much easier for a military leader to explain to the people around him that it is he who should rule the union of tribes, and maybe even the kingdom, which had yet to be created. In general, speaking of the army of the times of the barbarian kingdoms, it should be noted once again that it was a very universal, or as we would now say, hybrid army. Familiar to us, division into light and heavy infantry was in the armies of the barbarian Europe a simple convention, which often has nothing to do with the amount of armor worn by soldiers. Depending on the task at hand, the same soldiers could be built as in dense infantry formations, becoming very stable in defense, but not mobile, heavy infantry. And if necessary, having rearranged themselves into a sparse formation, they turned into excellent shooters, able to fulfill the role of not only shooters, but also mobile detachments, if the cavalry on the battlefield was absent. But the most attentive viewer will rightly note, why do you say about the absence of cavalry? Because there was. And in the Roman legions and some aliens from the east, well, yes, that's right, there was cavalry, but there was very little of it outside the Gothic kingdoms. Why? For many reasons. And the first is that the Roman military tradition from its inception to the fall of the Western Roman Empire was almost exclusively infantry. Cavalry in it was, for the most part, a force either auxiliary or allied. The Germans who came to Europe, with the exception perhaps of the Goths and their migratory neighbors, the Alans, also had no mass cavalry of their own. And so the fusion of Germanic and Roman military traditions, which had never relied on cavalry, could not produce anything other than excellent infantry. The second reason is that in the realities of early medieval Europe, light cavalry, and almost all the cavalry of barbarian Europe, with the exception perhaps Alanian was light cavalry, could not oppose the steadfast and disciplined infantry, standing in a deep and dense formation, that we see in almost all major battles of that time. Not having enough mass for a ramming blow, light cavalry on small horses had only to shell large masses of infantry and destroy the enemy fighters who had broken away from the formation, and to pursue the fleeing ones. With archers in barbarian Europe, the situation was the same as with cavalry. Neither the Romans nor the Germans did not have a long-shooting military school, preferring the bow to the weapon of throwing, and so it should not come as a surprise that the infantry of the barbarian kingdoms, which had adopted the basics of both military traditions, practically did not use bows, although they knew about them very well. But the number of throwers of all kinds, and accordingly, methyl weapons in all its diversity, was directly excessive. In the days of the barbarian kingdoms, it seems that everything was thrown, from axes and ancient, almost forgotten Mars barbs, which were barely a cubit long, to large and heavy angons, which were not inferior in size to a normal spear, and even exceeded it in weight. This is not to say that there were no archers on the battlefield. Of course they were, but their number was so insignificant that they were not even reduced to separate squads, putting them simply in the fourth or fifth row of the infantry formation, from where they supported their colleagues in the military craft to the best of their abilities. In general, as is clear, infantry reigned on European battlefields in those times. That means that the tactics of battles in those glorious times was, in general, simple and uncomplicated. Troops were built almost always in several lines, advancing the shooters that had to soften the enemy's ranks before the main battle, and to prevent the enemy's light infantry from doing the same to their allies. After such a greeting, the main forces, built into infantry phalanxes of great depth, entered the battle. These units, covered from the fire of large shields, slowly, trying not to break the formation, moved across the battlefield. Somewhere on the flanks was a small number of cavalry, exchanging with light infantry and each other a rain of arrows and darts. And the infantry. The infantry marched forward until they reached their opponent. After that, it was a matter of military skill and fighting spirit. Almost all the battles of the early Middle Ages, despite their utterly different, followed exactly the same scenario. After all the preliminary maneuvers, two large infantry units, both consisting of vigilantes and feared militia, would clash and fight until the militia of one side began to flee, having lost morale. The victors would then surround and finish off the remaining and almost never retreating vigilantes, and begin to pursue the fleeing militia. This is how armies fought in the lands of Burgundy, Franconia, Aquitaine, southern Britain, and among the rocks of the ancient north, wherever the young kingdoms of Europe were trying out their growing strength, claiming the inheritance left to them by the Eternal City. Few riflemen, few cavalry, and a lot of excellent infantry, in whose ranks you could not immediately recognize who was looking at you over his shield, a vigilante, a chieftain, or a simple community, brought to the battlefield by his luck. These were the warriors of the barbarian kingdoms. Simple, unsophisticated, and yet as deadly as a big iron sax they loved so much. They knew absolutely nothing about Byzantine military science and heavy shock cavalry. They never learned how to use riflemen or build siege machines. But they were perfectly able to win, even when it seemed impossible to win. After all, it makes no difference how strong your opponent is if you're ready to trade everything you have, even your life, for victory. And you're absolutely not ready to retreat simply because you have nowhere to retreat to. After all, everyone who has any value to you is fighting here in the same ranks as you. But time passed. The barbarian kingdoms grew, their armies grew, and less of the ancient warrior culture was in them. Armies became just armies, and infantry became just infantry. The men of the militia, who until recently had stood in the same ranks as the militia, were more and more often mounted on much older horses, providing themselves with additional mobility on the battlefield, and gradually turning into true knights. War has changed again, as it did centuries ago. However, that is another story.